You're listening to Secure Ventures, a show that follows cutting-edge founders in the cybersecurity space to understand their plights, glories, and revolutionary products. I'm your host, Kyle McNulty. I'm also a full-time investor at InQtel, a strategic investor for the U.S. intelligence and defense communities. This show is a personal outside activity separate from and not affiliated with InQtel in any manner. All comments, opinions, and sponsorships are wholly independent. With me in this episode is Amir Khayat. Amir is co-founder and CEO at Vorlon Security, which provides visibility and monitoring for SaaS app connections within an enterprise. For example, Vorlon can detect what other applications are connected to your Salesforce instance, along with what data is flowing between each relationship. This helps security teams detect data exfiltration, data leakage, improper configuration, and more. Before Vorlon, Amir worked his way from a software developer into progressively more customer-facing roles, most recently as a director at Palo Alto Networks. We kick off the episode talking about his early motivation to become a founder and how he led a decade of his career in pursuit of preparing himself for that role. Now, the team is continuing to focus on product and growth after raising $15 million last year from Accel and Shield Capital. This episode is brought to you by Vorlon. Vorlon helps teams defend against weaponized exploits by delivering the most comprehensive vulnerability and exploit intelligence in the market today. Vorlon gives enterprise and federal teams better, faster data so they can autonomously prevent exploits and reduce risk and outpace adversaries. So what's different about Vorlon? The company delivers its solutions to teams in machine-readable and consumable formats for a truly autonomous approach to vulnerability prioritization and exploit mitigation. Vorlon has close to 300 million unique data points, which is 5 times the exploits of ExploitDB, and 200 plus CVEs packaged into complete detection artifacts for proactive teams. Vorlon provides a full suite of solutions to enable teams with rapid adoption of Vorlon data, including its community tier of offerings and its enterprise-class solutions, exploit and vulnerability intelligence, and initial access intelligence. With Vorlon, teams can proactively defend against remote execution events, enrich every data source, and continuously outpace adversaries. If you're interested in learning more about Vorlon and checking out the free community edition where you can play with their database of known exploited vulnerabilities, please click the link in the show description so they know you came from the podcast. Amir, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me here, Kyle, today.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back through your career because I think you have a kind of interesting journey in terms of the specific roles that you were in and how those seem to kind of link into one another. Where you started as a software engineer back in 2010 or so, then you went to field engineer, and then sales engineer. And as I was looking at that progression, this is like a 4-year span where you take this leap between a couple of these different roles. And it seems like each one becomes slightly more customer facing, right? Again, the software engineer, then to a field engineer. So just working a little bit more with the customers hands-on, and then sales engineer, where your role is just becoming increasingly focused on the personal interactions that you're dealing with. I'd love to hear your story in terms of how that came about and what the transition was for you between those different roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, if I go back in time, and that was a long time ago, starting as a software engineer, when I was kind of reflecting the role of software engineer, and that was back in 2007 to 2010, I would say, something like that. I think that the involvement from a software engineer and market side was not as it is today. Today, for example, we're pushing engineer to be more and more and more listening to customer conversation, understanding how what they build is, impacting what's happening for the end user. But back then, I felt like I'm in a lab. I'm creating features, I'm fixing bugs, and that was kind of my day to day. And I'm a people person, and I also wanted to know how what we're actually building how it's being used, and what's the ROI, what's the impact on that. And that's what's kind of led me to start and think about, more customer facing roles. I think that around my MBA, I once I graduated my MBA, I was fully on the market, understanding, how trends are happening. And that's where I also, did a self-reflection and thought to myself, what do I want to be when I'll grow up? And I knew that I want to start a company, and the way on the path to building a company is actually going through different department in the company, understand the business in the best way, interact with as many different groups in the company. And that's kind of was my line of thinking when I progressing with my career.
Hmm. That's super fascinating. I think a lot of the guests that I've spoken with in the past have this idea of what can I do to set myself up for starting a company in the future and leading a company. But I haven't seen quite that same progression. And I think it actually lends itself very nicely, like you described, where you're kind of a technical co-founder, founder, because you have that software engineering experience, but then you've also worked on the sales side, which is obviously such an important role as CEO. But help me understand, like what year is it that we're talking when you decide that you want to be a CEO at some point? Are we talking like 1995 or are we talking like 2012 after you have your first role as a field engineer?
I I I believe again, when I was software engineer in a small startup, I was starting to see the dynamic that the
Yeah.
entrepreneur and the co-founder are starting to push the company and build that, and that made me very much excited. And I know that I have a long way to get to their experience and the understanding on how to build a company, and that kind of like drive my focus. Back then, when we were talking about again 2007, 2008,
Yeah.
that's where I kind of like my ambitious to start my own company started, and I was very much driving my career to understand and to surround myself through around entrepreneurs that are building their company so I can learn and see what they do on their day to day.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit more about that. What else did you do to kind of set yourself up for starting a company in the future besides, like you mentioned, kind of putting yourself in the startup ecosystem, changing the actual roles that you're working in? Like, are you trying to find more ways to network with investors, like 4 or 5 plus years before you're even going to start a company? Are you trying to start like incubating different ideas or meeting different accelerators or like learning about the ecosystem more specifically? I'm just curious what that kind of broader plan and strategy looked like for you.
Yeah, I think kind of all of the above, and I will say
Mm.
also understanding execution better. So before moving to sales, I spent a few years in what's called today customer success, but back then it was more professional services deployment, and I think that helped me to understand what happens once the sales happen and how you can make customers successful, expand in those deals. So it was very much focused on execution, understanding again, the different phases, maybe a little bit the other way around, building a product, see how you deploy the product, and then I move to the sales side of things. But when I said all of the above, yes, definitely surround myself in an environment of founders. I'm coming from Israel. There is a large community of entrepreneurs and co-founders, and many of them are good friends. So learning from their experience, understanding the challenges that they have, which I will say, once you're in the front seat, it's nothing like what you hear when you're on the side. Like you can't understand it really, but and also on the VC angle, following up different investors, listening to different podcasts when the time started, it will become more popular, go to event and again, learn the way that investors and also bootstrap company functions so you can get to the decision what works better for you, at least for me, when the time will come.
Who was the most important person for you during this time period, for kind of like setting you up and giving you guidance, for thinking about that future?
Great question. I have a very long list of people that I can think now.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking about many years. I think I will start and say definitely, first of all, my wife.
Good answer.
Yeah, exactly. No, but to be serious, I think that, she's coming from the financial world, and then just hearing her day to day helped me to understand things from investor perspective and how they do things. So it's definitely that was, looking at someone that helped me to understand things much, much, much better. That was in our living room, right? And then going to different people that went through my career, I will say that my last experience before we were acquired by Palo Alto Network with the Demisto co-founder, all four, was a huge lesson for me, just to see how they act on their day to day, how they set goals and how they execute towards them. I think that was one of the best experience that I had in my career, and it followed up with a great success also before Palo and also in Palo as one of the leading product that they are selling today.
Yeah, and you were at Palo during a very interesting period when Nikesh came on board and they really started ramping up a lot of those different acquisitions as well, right? I'm curious to hear your perspective, especially being involved as kind of the sales and solutions side as all these new products are coming in, how this changed your perspective on growing a security company and what the potential exit might actually look like.
Yeah, it was, looking back, I was very fortunate to be in this time when Nikesh just started and, triple X the company basically. Um, I think that people have the assumption that, large organization move slow. I think what made the big success of Palo was the fact that it was built by with a startup DNA, right? From the beginning, and every acquisition, I think, just helped this mentality and this DNA growth and help the company to move fast. So Nikesh started a concept of speedboats in a large company, and I think that was something that, for me, again, when I look back, helped me to see things in scale and start to think in scale. If I was before in startups, Israeli size enterprise, I would say, which is nothing like the US, basically, being part of this battleship and see how it drives and while having a startup DNA, I think that was a huge learning experience that can, accelerate execution, basically.
Hmm. Tell me more about this speedboat idea. I get the general concept of like, hey, you have smaller teams that are going fast, but what more is there to that kind of theory?
Yeah, so it was, again, the philosophy was that clearly, there is the umbrella, which is the core product that Palo provides, but in the end of the day, the stakeholder or the people that you're selling them within the organization are different people. So you can't just go in the same line that you used to when you sold firewalls back then. And Nikesh philosophy was, when I joined Palo, was let's reduce obstacles, let's try to run fast, create momentum and opportunities uh, um, under the umbrella, but be more individual group that can run fast under this umbrella. So remove obstacles from a corporate perspective, and we saw, a huge success when we act like that back then.
Yeah. Obviously, this is for a bigger company that's trying to remain agile and, like you mentioned, sell through kind of new swim lanes. Is there any piece, though, of this kind of speedboat methodology or any other way that Palo operated at this time that you've tried to really pull into Vorlon?
I think the speedboat concept again goes back to the startup DNA. Again,
Hmm.
in a startup, it's easier to run fast, to have less politic, less dynamic, and I think, again, going back to your question before, it reduced just politic
Yeah.
and in startups, if you have politic in a startup, that's already a bad signals. I think that you need to build the right culture to be able to execute fast, listen to your customer, identify opportunities. So I wouldn't say that there is an analogy except for the fact that a speedboat is a concept of a startup within a large company.
Yeah, that's super fair. Um, Say a little bit more about this politics piece, because I think this is interesting. To your point, the kind of like toxic political culture can absolutely crush a startup. What do you think is the right approach to take in order to avoid this kind of political dynamic as much as possible? Anything beyond just kind of like encouraging each individual on the team, like making sure they have room for growth, trying to provide them the resources they need. Like, is there any personal strategy that you found works well to avoid that political dynamic?
I think in the end of the day, it's all about people, right? Yeah, there are roles and definitely hierarchy in large organization, and that's one of the challenge. And I don't think, with my experience, I can go and say what is the right way. I think that in the end of the day, if you understand how to encourage discussion and conversation, and allow people to express their ideas in a way that the organization can accept that. And it's not just, hey, there is a VP on the call, so let's just stay silent and let's just understand what he wants. I think that helps companies to drive for success. And at least in the places that I've been, and these are things that I'm trying to follow at Vorlon, is everyone has different opinion about different things. It's always good to listen and not to block conversation. Yes, there is a time that need to take a decision, but I think that the way that you build the culture in the organization and the respect that you have to your peers, that's what helps you to drive to a better success. And I've seen that at Palo when I was there, and I think these are the things that I've seen in different companies that I was part of their success, and definitely these are things that I'm trying to follow with Vorlon.
Yeah. Okay, so we've jumped ahead a little bit because I'm already asking you about the culture of Vorlon and thinking about how you've strategized around building it. But let's take a step back and actually talk about the transition that you made from Palo to Vorlon. You already mentioned that you had these kind of ideas for about a decade at this point that you wanted to start a company. And then in 2022, you take the jump from Palo to actually go ahead and start it. What did that look like? Why was it the right time? How did that come together?
So first of all, I will say that my co-founder Amir Khayat and I were kind of like brainstorming
Mm.
in different time zones for a few years. Amir Khayat was one of the very first software engineers at Demisto, and
Mm.
he supported me a lot while we were trying to sell Demisto back then in 2017, 2016. So we had this relationship and we started to brainstorm and mainly to identify opportunities. And I think that being part of this growing phase at Palo brought us in front of Fortune 500, Fortune 100, almost on a daily basis. And when you're just, listen to customers, you learn a lot and you identify opportunities. And I think that, you know, the moment that it hit us was when we were in the Southeast here in the United States, working with a Fortune 500 company while deploying one of their products for a potential sales. And suddenly we saw that the CEO of the company is traveling to Japan and is approving financial transactions. And we were the vendor and we were like, holy shit, like, should we let them know? Are we supposed to see that kind of data? And I think that was where both of us kind of like had the conversation around this is a huge gap. And this gap happens because the industry goes away from the traditional controls and there is an opportunity. And that's where we start again to run a lot of validation call through our network and started the ideation of Vorlon.
And so what did you do in that scenario? Did you go ahead and alert the company?
Yeah, we definitely shared them that we're
Okay.
seeing some information that probably, again, it looks legit, but if I have access to see that, they need to make sure that no one else has access to see that type of thing. So yeah, definitely we were fully transparent with a
Okay.
specific user that we work with. Yeah.
Okay. So then as you think about this solution, what does the kind of early like minimum viable product look like in your mind? It sounds like more kind of data visibility into how just information is shared across all the different platforms. Of course, I'm cheating a little bit because I know where your product has gone to today. But what does that look like?
Yeah, great question. So, back then where it was, it's definitely nothing like where it is
Okay.
today. We were definitely super ambitious at the beginning to stop that and not just to, let them know what they don't know, but actually to be proactive about it and to take it to the next phase.
Mm.
And create a solution that will be more intrusive. I think that as you go and you learn that when you're not coming from a big logo like Palo Alto's, there is more risk to companies to bet on your solution if you want to be too intrusive in a way. So that's where, again, we learn a lot listening to our customers and understanding what will be the first thing that we will help them that keeps them up at night. And as you mentioned, that was definitely letting them know about the things that they don't know. But we didn't stop there, obviously, because knowing is one thing. Now, what do you need to do in order to solve those things? And I think that was our main focus and how we can actually connect all the dots, understanding what is important and how you actually reduce this risk or remove this actually risk. And that was our main focus as a company back then, and that's still our focus as a company.
Yeah. So from a technology approach, let me give you a chance to just kind of put it in your words exactly what Vorlon does today.
So we're focusing on three things, starting with letting you know what you don't know. Think about, with the move to cloud and SaaS application today, the complexity is exponential. We, as a small startup today, if you will ask me now, without Vorlon, how many third-party SaaS application or hybrid solution we consume today, honestly, I will tell you, let me go check at Vorlon, because that requires maintenance and it changes on a daily basis. So I think, first of all, again, to discover who pull your data, who owns your data, because it's no longer the on-premise game that you control that. So that's phase one that we do. And then starting to understand and learn all these data movement and communication in order to identify where you are at risk, how you can pay attention and prioritize, and then how do you remediate that? So these three stages are what we provide today to companies with a low effort.
One of the things that always comes across my mind when I think about a solution like this is the challenge that comes with integrating with all these different SaaS platforms, right? Because what you're ultimately doing is trying to pull access, like posture, let's say, across all these different solutions that are connected to one another and kind of monitor activity in terms of what's being shared across each of these different SaaS connections, right? And as part of that, you need to be very much in the loop with what these different connections are sharing, how you can best monitor these interactions. Maybe you need to make API calls with each of these different tools that's actually being used. What kind of challenges did that present in terms of working with the different companies that you're integrating with? Or were you able to do it without actually, let's say, working with something like a Slack and just do it completely independent? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think when you're building a technology solution, you need to understand how you can bring value in today's world with a minimal effort, right? Because in the end of the day, definitely when you sell to large enterprises, you will need to go cross different functions in the organization in order to start and deploy your product. And I think that was kind of like our North Star. It might be maybe because, many of our team members has the sales engineering experience of building the technology, but let's see how we're building something that it will not take 8-12 months to show an ROI. And I think the way that we approached it is, let's take advantage of the existing technology today and the ability to do things in an easy way. I'll give you an example. Instead of now go and deploy something in the architecture, you can leverage OAuth and basically rely on the user permission to do it seamlessly. So you don't need to bring the specific business application owner to the picture. If you have the right permission to access some data, you can leverage OAuth and make everyone's life easier and the ROI faster.
Yeah. Okay, so help me understand a little bit further then the kind of specific mechanism of how Vorlon is kind of providing this data or making these decisions, right? You're hooked into all these SaaS applications that an organization is using. Say it's like a Salesforce instance and a Slack instance and like a Microsoft 365 instance. And your role, if I'm understanding it correctly, is trying to monitor the different permissions that are being used across each of these platforms and the data that's being pulled from each of these platforms, so you can like surface detections as far as potentially incorrect or misused privileges. Is that all fair?
Almost.
Okay,
I
correct
think
me.
that yeah. So we're approaching it for more of a holistic way, I would say. I think there are three key things that you need to review when you're looking on those platforms. So you're 100% accurate around we're monitoring these applications. I think that going back to what we just discussed around reducing the effort, when you start to observe an application with Vorlon, and you can start with a one crown jewel application. Um, our technology um, basically start to discover all the different applications that are talking with this specific SaaS application. And we can discover today over thousands of different applications. And the more, again, we see data and we correlate things, we will have obviously a larger coverage. But I think from an effort perspective, you don't need now to go and deploy all these tools, right? You can deploy one tool as your starting point, the one that holds according to your assumption as a security organization, the most sensitive information, whether it's PCI, PII, or PHI, depends on the vertical. And we will start to analyze it and to discover and highlight where is your most sensitive data go. So going back to the more holistic approach, I think that we all agree that data is the new oil, and data will drive your priorities as well, right? It's not just a misconfiguration. I'll give you an example. If right now I'm a designer that use Canva and I edit it as part of my add-on, right? And I have token with full permission to Canva, right? Uh, um, there is probably less percentage that someone will get into the organization from that specific application, unlike, again, you mentioned Salesforce or an HR tool or an ERP that suddenly we are detecting data movement going to China, for example, right? Like this is more important, but privilege best practice is there. So it's more around the focus over the data. And that includes, right, the access permission on top of that.
So tell me a little bit more about the differentiation compared to the more traditional like security operations, security monitoring use case, right? So these companies already have like a full security operations center stood up to try to monitor malicious activity within their organization. Uh, Traditionally, it's much more focused on like EDR logs and like network activity than it is for like SaaS application activity, in part just because there's so many application logs, right? But what has been the like core differentiation you've seen in talking with some of these different customers or prospective customers that has made them really resonate with the Vorlon story? Like, why aren't they using their existing SOC structure to build these detections instead?
Great question. I'll start to say with the effort, again, talking about the number. Basically, that means that you will need to have an army of people that will need to go and build rules for you to push them to, your SIEM, for example, or any other tool that you're using in your process. So that definitely is something that right thing. And I think that, if I'll go back to one of our customer stories, there is a company that we work with that reach out to us post a breach that they had with a CI/CD tool more than a year ago. And the time that it took them, their security team, to understand what was the impact on them as a company was around 4 months back then. And that was because they needed to contact the business application owner to start map access and data fields and understand if there was a real exposure to them or not. Now, fast forward a year after, when they were already using Vorlon, and when the Snowflake breach occurred, for them that was a couple of minutes activity, right? Reducing this time, which cost the organization a lot of money, with a product that they paid, way less than an army of people to go and investigate it, was their immediate ROI. And I think that what we've seen and what we've experiencing, working with different security organization and with the CISO, is facing this question: is the business capable to deal with an exposure that they don't have answer to, and it's all about time in the end? Or if they want to be ahead of the curve and ahead of the threat, if they want a solution that will help them to detect those things.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a step back from the technology for a minute and talk a little bit more about just the kind of broader Vorlon journey and tying this back to some of your previous experience. We talked a little bit about the kind of like acquisition strategy of Nikesh at Palo Alto and your role and experience within that. How did that influence, when you were building Vorlon, your thoughts on like pushing for an IPO versus pushing for a company to be acquired, especially in the context of so many cybersecurity companies that I think are given a lot of, maybe let's say, like criticism within the broader ecosystem, saying that like most cyber companies are not fit for IPO compared to other verticals?
I love this question. I think that, what led me to build a company is first building something meaningful that will contribute to people in the end of the day, people that are working for companies and people that will work or are working for the company that I started together with my founding team and with my co-founder. I think that ambitious is great. And definitely, there are different paths that company can go, but you can't really predict the future. And what's our North Star is mainly to identify the challenges that company has and to build a product that will fit there. So back to your question, I did not have in mind, when I started Vorlon, I didn't think I'm going to do an exit here or I'm going to go all the way to IPO. If I will be able to build a business with our team, right, that will be sustainable and will take us to an IPO, I think that the opportunity is there. There is a huge gap today in the industry around, and there is a movement, again, moving away from the traditional controls, create that gap. And I think that if we will be able to execute, Vorlon will grow to a large company. And back to your question, if you look today and the number of traded company on the security, there are not so many. And I think that it takes time to build a company, and things are super rapid on the cybersecurity. And I think that's kind of like create the motion of acquisition, but still there is a lot of room to grow small companies to become a large one, because the market is infinity around the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're very on the nose with one piece you said in particular, which is it takes a lot of time to build a company, right? It's a very long journey. And I like the point. I actually haven't heard that before around how, because cybersecurity is just moving so quickly compared to a lot of other industries, that there's more kind of appetite for acquisition from some of the larger players, which is then maybe tempting in some ways for a lot of the companies that start receiving those different offers and very difficult to pass up. And I think that's an interesting statement. Well, one of the other things that occurred to me that I wanted to make sure we touched on here was thinking back to the beginning of this conversation. You'd mentioned, hey, I had this idea of what I wanted to do to prepare myself to be a leader at a company, prepare myself to be a founder. We talked about the finance advice from your wife, the change to be more customer facing, some of the smart founders you got to work with at Demisto. You're now a few years into your journey at Vorlon. Looking back, what's something that you wish you'd done a little bit earlier back in, let's say, like the early 2010s that would have prepared yourself in another way that you ended up realizing was incredibly important in the Vorlon journey?
I love this question. I think that going deep on a specific industry help you to understand the real challenges with your potential ICPs. Fast forward to where I am right now. I think that in cybersecurity, because it's such a big need, and when a company get to a maturity level that they need a security program, it happens to every company and different vertical and different segments. And I think that that's one of the challenges when you start to build your company, is where to focus, because everyone needs security, right? But if you want the quickest ROI, I think that if you know a specific vertical very well and the dynamic around that, that probably will help you to get to a fast result, right?
Yeah. What did you end up doing in order to more rapidly learn this vertical once you realized the value of that depth?
Laser focus on that. And honestly,
Okay.
I still don't have the answer. And I think that, everyone wants to go after financials because they're highly regulated, right? It's a red ocean around that. Everyone understands that. But I think that if you understand the way the big business function, and again, what are their challenges, and it's not only on the financial. If you're looking at other verticals, I think that will help you to execute faster and to be more meaningful for your end customers in the end of the day. That will, drive both of the success from their side and from your side.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we wrap here, I want to tie back to one of the pieces that we talked about in this kind of M&A versus IPO discussion, where you said, hey, we haven't fully decided yet. Our goal is to build something valuable, continue to grow, and make sure that we're providing something of use to the broader ecosystem. If you stand where you are today and think like, okay, this is what we need to do to get to IPO, what's the real functionality expansion that you think you need to make at Vorlon to reach that point? Is there any kind of core capability or expansion of the vision that you think is necessary to reach that point?
Again, we're 2 years in the journey. As I said, it takes a lot of time to build a company and definitely to bring it to IPO. Unless the fairy of luck touched you, like it happened with Wiz and some other companies. But people think that this is the speed that companies are growing, and we know that that's not the case. I think that in the end of the day, you're starting with an offering and you're learning, and the more time, the more customer you add to your customer base, you understand if it fits your vision or if you need to change things along the way. Proud to say that I think that our first vision around being a meaningful player that will help mitigate the challenges in the SaaS ecosystem is still our North Star, basically. And I believe, again, on the market opportunity, it exists. And the more time goes, I think it will be big engine in our growth. So I don't have an explicit answer to your question. I would say that time and keep listening will help you to understand if you need to change the vision or continue in the same path that you started from day one.
Yeah. Like you said, you've only been around for a couple of years. It was a bit of an unfair question, but I was curious to see what you said. So Amir, I really appreciate the time. I think this was an awesome conversation. We got to cover a whole ton, and I appreciated walking through the kind of narrative of you setting yourself up for success as a founder over a decade in advance and what those specifics looked like. So thanks for sharing some of your advice and experience.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a great question. Really enjoyed that. And I think just to summarize it, it's mainly around the team that you build, executing to the goal, and the customer that you need to listen to.
Awesome. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can write to me at kyle@secureventures.io. I'm Kyle McNulty, and you've been listening to Secure Ventures.